pleasure to be with you all. Shalom. Just a little bit about myself. I was actually born in Paris, grew up in Australia. I have a father from Morocco and a mother from Uzbekistan. So I'm doing an international press conference when I speak to myself. But it's lovely to have such a broad group of people from across the world. What I hope to do is just to speak briefly about the recent developments and their significance, including some of their legal aspects, and then open it up for questions. When I used to give talks, I often used to start by saying that my resume is just a list of failures because I've been involved in every failed round of negotiations with the Palestinians for the last 2 decades. And my children used to say that the way to achieve peace is to remove me from the process, because every time I'm there, it doesn't seem to work very well. But I can't do that talking point anymore because I've been involved in a successful process, which I hope also is successful not just in the bilateral relationships between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, Sudan and others, but also in what it might mean for the region more broadly. And I want to talk a little bit about that success. I'll mention a few general points, and then Lior can perhaps moderate the question process. I think with any success, there are always lots of people who want to claim credit for that success, and a lot of credit is due in lots of places. The dynamics that brought about the breakthroughs with the UAE and Bahrain and now Sudan are complicated. It's never easy, I think, if you're analyzing something seriously, to say what is the thing that happened, right? So obviously we have an increasing convergence of interests with states in the region in terms of the threats we face, particularly Iran, that kind of pushed us together. We have a huge investment by the US administration in this effort. I think courageous decisions by the leaders as well. And perhaps important to mention, one of the key dimensions I think that helped particularly the UAE and Bahrain deal move forward was that these are countries in which the foreign ministry in particular and Israel in general has invested a great deal of effort in cultivating the relationship behind the scenes, below the radar for almost 2 decades now. So what appeared to the world as a kind of sudden breakthrough for Israel in a way was the culmination of a natural process. And I wanted to begin with this idea that, in a way, the unnatural thing, in my view, is for us not to have relations with these countries, because the convergence of interests is so clear, the potential of these relationships is so clear, that the idea that countries would not seek to advance their interests is something that we have to ask, how long could it be sustained for? And I think for a long time, and I'll get to this a bit later, there was this idea that, normalization of Israel with its neighbors should happen at a later stage and progress with the Palestinians should happen first. And I think the sustainability of that idea kind of evaporated over time. And countries who had real significant interests in confronting the threats of the region, but in also taking advantage of the opportunities, I think increasingly feeling like they can't have those interests held hostage to another conflict of which they are not directly involved. In terms of the legal role, I guess I wanted to say, I've been a legal advisor for Israel for a long time. And sometimes I realize that the lawyers are brought into the room, not always because decisions should be made, but in a way to kind of avoid making decisions, to make things, to kind of have constructive ambiguity so a decision can't be made. In Hebrew, we have a saying that you have lawyers who find solutions to problems and lawyers who find problems with solutions. And you can sometimes make the lawyer comes into the room and makes things more complicated. And very often, particularly I think in the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, the role of the lawyer has been very often to articulate the argument of each side rather than to look for ways to actually bridge those arguments which require kind of courageous political decisions. And what was so interesting for me about the process, particularly of negotiating the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain was that the lawyers were in the room to help facilitate decisions rather than to complicate things or to raise arguments. We were very much there to translate decisions that were made into reality. And I found in my Emirati and Bahraini counterparts the equal amount of enthusiasm and willingness to look for ways to move forward. We flew to Abu Dhabi in that first famous official Israeli flight, it was a historic flight for me, first of all, because obviously it was part of that special mission to Abu Dhabi. It was humorous also because the pilot was called Tal Becker. Whenever I Google Tal Becker, I see the pilot, not myself. And both Tal Becker the pilot and Tal Becker the lawyer were on the flight to Abu Dhabi. I'm glad I wasn't flying the plane. And the atmosphere on the plane and when we landed was an atmosphere of incredible feeling of potential. And the role that we as lawyers played was simply to give voice to that potential in real terms. And I think what's most significant about the agreements that we reached with the UAE and Bahrain so far, and there are many more on the way, is that they essentially try to front load, try to put the focus on how to change the reality on the ground for Israelis, Emiratis, Bahrainis as quickly as possible. These are not pieces of paper as much as they are ways in which to help transform reality quickly. And I would say if we compare these agreements to the agreements with Egypt and Jordan, our peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan are critical, they are strategic, but they have not yet translated into a warm peace that makes Israelis feel like they are seen and accepted as a natural part of the region. These agreements are different in that respect. The warm embrace, the idea that Israelis are being told, how quickly can you come here, how quickly can we visit you, is very different. And it's not by accident, for those of you who are following this, that, for example, with the Emirates, the first agreements we signed were an agreement for aviation, for direct flights, an agreement for investment, to allow investment and the protection of investments in both societies. And perhaps most significantly, the UAE is the first Arab country in which Israel has a visa waiver agreement where citizens of both countries do not need to apply to a visa. And the UAE will be the first Arab country that their citizens can visit Israel without a visa, and Israel can visit the UAE without a visa. And these are things, if you look at them conceptually, finance, aviation, and visas are the things that are the infrastructure of a relationship. They set the stage for the people to actually feel the difference very, very quickly. And in that way, I think, even before we negotiated the agreements, there were flights that had begun. The boycott, the Arab boycott, the UAE had cancelled it. There were direct phone lines. There's a real emphasis here on making this agreement felt, not just at the level of political leaders and photo ops, but at the level of the average citizen. And I'll get back to that and how important that is. Before that, I wanted to mention something else about the agreements that I think is very significant. One of the clauses in the agreement with the UAE that has an echo in the agreement with Bahrain talks about the fact that the Jewish and Arab peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and that as descendants of that ancestor, in that spirit, as common descendants, they need to look to promote coexistence between all peoples and all religions throughout the Middle East. Now, for some, this may look like a kind of symbolic statement, but I think it has real significance. Because, as you know, one of the core challenges in this conflict is for Israel's natural place in the region to be accepted, for the Jewish people's right to self-determination, its belonging to the Middle East, to be accepted. And this, in a way, this idea embedded in this agreement is a legitimization from the Arab world, from a key state in the Arab world, of the Jewish people's right to self-determination in the Middle East, of the Jewish people's inherent belonging in the Middle East, and in a way, a pushback against all the forces of delegitimization. And I think that's very important. And what's especially important is that, in a way, the order of that recognition has been reversed. For a long time, the Arab states essentially said, let the Palestinians, in their negotiations with Israel, make the concessions, recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish people, and then we will follow. But what that did was leave the Palestinians alone to make that decision. By reversing, by having Arab states begin to articulate that Israel and the Jewish people have a natural and inherent part of the region, it can have this legitimizing effect that enables it in time, I hope, not immediately, but in time, that makes it easier, more legitimate for Palestinians to come to terms, finally, with the Jewish people's right to self-determination, alongside the Palestinians. And this brings me, I think, to one of the core kind of breakthroughs of this agreement. And it's, I think, important to understand the Israeli mindset in this perspective. For so long, there was this idea that normalization between Israel and the Arab states should be left to the end of the process as a kind of incentive for Israelis, like a pot at the end of the rainbow. And the idea was, and you hear some of this criticism on the Palestinian side, that by enabling normalization to happen now, it somehow takes away an incentive from the Israeli public. And I think it's really important to understand why the logic of that is, I think, actually correct in the opposite. It's that it doesn't work that way. Why is it that the idea that normalization was an incentive at the end didn't really work with the Israeli public? I think, frankly, the reason was that it wasn't believable. It wasn't believable that the promise could be turned into a reality. There's so many messages that Israeli Jews receive from the region about the hostility towards them, that some promise at the end of the day, if you make these decisions, you will then get that normalization, felt less like a promise and more like a kind of ultimatum. I would say that one of the core challenges we have faced, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, is not how do we produce change, but how do we generate a belief in the possibility of change? How do we make the societies believe that change is possible? Because so many in both societies think that the conflict is a permanent part of the landscape. I have 6 children. My eldest children, I think, grew up with a feeling that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the rejection of Israel within the region was a kind of inevitable thing. That what they needed to figure out how to live their lives with the conflict interfering as little as possible. But they didn't have the ability to imagine their lives in real terms without the conflict, with Israelis being fully accepted in the region. And what's so significant about these agreements, beyond their potential for the bilateral relationships and in kind of classical foreign policy ways in terms of cooperation on peace and security across the region, is the psychological impact of translating these agreements on the ground to make Israelis in particular believe that it is possible for the Middle East to be different, to be better, for Jews in the Middle East to be accepted. It reminds me of this Aesop's fable. I think many of you might know it, of when the wind and the sun have a bet as to who can take a person's coat off. And the wind says, I know how to take a person's coat off. I will blow very hard, and that will make the coat blow off. So the wind tries to blow off the coat, and the man just holds onto his coat tighter because the wind is blowing so strongly. And then the sun comes out and says, how will I take the person's coat off? And the sheer heat of the sun makes the person want to take off their coat. And I think that that's an important parallel when it comes to understanding the way in which Israelis are seeing these agreements. These agreements are saying in real terms, in real ways, that Israelis can be accepted in the region, that the hostility is not a permanent feature. And by doing that, we create an ability to take seriously the ways in which to move forward. And I think that's important. So I see in these agreements not just the bilateral potential in investment and healthcare and technology and fighting desertification and all kinds of ways in which the parties are identifying more and more agreements. We have tens of agreements in the works in terms of cooperation with the UAE and Bahrain in particular. And not just in terms of this cooperation, both for opportunities but also against threats in the region. But also, I think, in creating this dynamic, which has been so missing in the Middle East for such a long time, that we can envisage a different kind of Middle East. And when people begin to think that is possible, I think you begin to create the legitimacy for decisions that push that change and make it possible. And I'm hopeful that eventually that dynamic will feel, in a way, inevitable even on the Palestinian side, that this opportunity, the Palestinian people will demand to be part of this opportunity. I did want to share one final thought, and then I'll open it up for questions. I've often found that when I speak to people about conflicts in general, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, they are either driven by what I might call a justice paradigm to the conflict, or what you could call a peace paradigm of the conflict. And the justice paradigm is this paradigm that tries to figure out who is right and who is wrong in the conflict, and imagines that the way we resolve the conflict is by making sure that we make a determination: whoever is wrong should be held accountable, whoever is right should be vindicated. And these are the ways in which the conflict is spoken about, for instance, in the halls of the United Nations, where different players want to have vindication for their story. And the other paradigm is a peace paradigm. And the peace paradigm basically says that the way in which you push people together involves mutual recognition, but not this attempt to demonize one side and legitimize the other, but to recognize, and especially in the Palestinian conflict, that this is a conflict of two peoples, each with rights and obligations, and they need to accommodate one another. And that involves encouraging coexistence, encouraging communication, pushing them together rather than polarizing. And if you look at the different dynamics at play in the Middle East at the moment, in the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic at the moment, you have some pushing in one direction and some in the other. I firmly believe that these normalization agreements are agreements which essentially say that the way forward is by creating opportunity through coexistence, through cooperation. We have other initiatives, for example, in the International Criminal Court, which essentially tries to put the conflict in this black and white language. There is one side with rights, one side with obligations. And what that does is push the parties aside. So I am hopeful that people's energies, given this amazing opportunity, will be pushed in that direction. And the role of lawyers like me will be less to argue a case, right? Less to create the talking points about why one side is right and the other side is wrong. Because lawyers can play another role too, and that's the role of using a common language to imagine a better future, to give words and ideas to a better future. And that's the role that lawyers played in the Israeli UAE and Israeli Bahrain discussions, being asked to kind of turn big decisions into realistic ways to move forward. And I hope it's the role that Israeli lawyers and other lawyers can play as we work together with other countries in the region and with the Palestinians, our neighbors. So thank you. I'm happy to take more specific questions.
Thank you so much, Tal. We'll try to take some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand if your camera is on. And if you can also ask me on the chat to ask a question. And we'll start with Rafi Berg. Unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks very much. Very interesting presentation. You mentioned the ICC there just at the end. So I wanted to ask you if I could put two questions in one as a matter of fact. There are preliminary proceedings going on at the ICC at the moment to decide whether to allow Israel to be investigated for war crimes. How do you see that playing out in the longer term in developing more relations between Israel and more Arab countries? What respect do you think that the duties the ICC might have on that? And secondly, you also mentioned in passing back, Sudan is clearly a much less warm normalization than the UAE and Bahrain. Do you see that as something which can be which will get better, or do you think Sudan will be a much more difficult nut to crack in terms of enabling the population to accept Israel?
Well, thank you for the question. With respect to the ICC, I hope and believe it will not have an effect on the normalization process with additional Arab countries, because I think the interests are so clear in terms of the potential for moving things forward. Almost all Arab countries are not members of the ICC. It's also worth mentioning. But I am worried about the impact it has on the dynamics in the Israeli-Palestinian context in particular. For those of you who are not familiar with the ICC case, it is a highly controversial case where there's a real argument that's going on about whether the ICC even has jurisdiction in this case. The ICC jurisdiction is limited to states, and there's a very broad view that Palestine is not yet a state. That's a subject for negotiation. It requires defined territory, and that's a matter for negotiation. You can't say that there's defined territory. And many states and international experts have themselves made submissions to the court, including amongst the court's highest donors, such as Germany, Australia, and others, saying the court should not proceed as it doesn't have jurisdiction. But the bigger point, I think, for the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic relates to what I said before about what narrative this tells about the conflict, who it incentivizes. The minute you try to criminalize the way you talk about a conflict, you incentivize each side to try to delegitimize and demonize the other. And I think what you need are dynamics that push the parties together and not pull them apart. There is always this tension between peace and justice in any conflict resolution. But I think the idea that the ICC can be a source of justice in this case is really an illusion. The ICC's involvement in this would be highly political because it's so controversial. It requires a criminal court to make decisions on issues that are really not for a criminal tribunal, they're for political negotiations. And more importantly, or more fundamentally, I would say, if you think about this conflict in terms of how best to address the needs of Israelis and Palestinians, will they be better addressed by a criminal court with questionable jurisdiction in The Hague that is pulling the parties apart, or by a dynamic where each side moves towards dialogue and addresses the needs of both peoples? And so I think we should try to embrace any initiative that helps push the parties together and recognize one another's legitimacy. And it is destructive and frankly counterproductive to advance initiatives that play this kind of zero-sum game. And I think that's problematic in the ICC context. With respect to your question on Sudan, I mean, obviously Sudan is a country in transition, and every country that we warm relations to will have to take into account the particulars of the situation in that country. We will work with the Sudanese officials and government to do what we can to improve the relationship. The pace of that, will depend on the political possibilities and political will on each side. We're looking forward to it, but we have a realistic approach. Each country is different, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach in this respect. But we're moving in a positive direction, and I think that's the key.
Thank you so much, Tal. And I saw that Mai has a question. Do you want to ask it, or?
Yes, sure.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Hola,
Buenos
¿cómo
días
estás?
desde...
Hi, I am May Zambra from Mexico, from Enlace Judío Mexico. And I would like to ask, what were the main challenges in wording the United Emirates Israel normalization?
It's a good question, but I don't tend to offer what happens inside the negotiating room. To be frank, there were not a lot of differences. I won't talk about the differences that were, but there weren't a lot of differences. There was really a meeting of the minds in terms of what we were trying to do and the potential here. I've seen a lot of people comment on whether it's right to call something a treaty of peace if there hasn't been a state of war beforehand. So I'll just perhaps take this opportunity to mention that as a matter of law, there are quite a few treaties that countries call treaties of peace even if there hasn't been a state of war, because that gives expression to what the countries are trying to do. They're trying to develop a genuinely peaceful relationship. And I think the minute we had a meeting of the minds as to what we were trying to do, it was a very quick negotiation, right? So to give you a sense, the negotiations with Jordan, the peace treaty with Jordan took us 2 years. Yes? And of course, there's a history there and there's history of conflict which makes it more complicated. The negotiations with the UAE took a couple of weeks, took several weeks. And that's very, very good.
Thank you. And I saw there, I'll try to pronounce the name, Barjejan. Do you want to ask the question?
Yes. My name is...
Sorry if I missed it.
You hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Barjejan, and I am from Canada. I would like to know when you talk about negotiation between Israeli and Palestinian. I think the negotiation, the first started in 47, 48, 73, 67, 2000. And always the same language is coming back, it's coming back, it's coming back. Do you think the Palestinian, so-called Palestinian, have a new proposal to bring on the table, or they are still limiting themselves to what they said since 70 years?
So I want to answer this carefully. It's true that there has been different moments of negotiation. The most serious negotiation has been from the Oslo process forward, with 3 big efforts. I think the Camp David process, the Annapolis process, and the Kerry process. You know, as someone who has been in the room for a lot of the negotiations, I see little differences where maybe people looking from the outside don't see so many differences. And so I can appreciate your perspective. I have to say, from my own view, I think the goal we have is always to try to make things better and to look at ways in which we can empower different actors more moving towards peace and coexistence, and disempower those who are opposed to that. We don't have there's no university you go to get a degree in how peace is possible. There's no guarantees, but when you're involved in trying to give advice to a country, you're always just trying to make things better. So I can't answer your question whether it's never going to end or not. I do think that nothing is inevitable, that we can try to influence it, and I do believe that the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain and hopefully other countries do offer an opportunity to create a different dynamic, and over time to perhaps signal to the Palestinian people and leadership that a strategy of all or nothing is a problematic strategy in the Middle East. You know, I have a colleague who says that in the Middle East, if you go for all or nothing, you will inevitably get nothing. And imagining what is possible and trying to move to there is really critical. And I think these agreements have created that opening. And I hope in time that others will realize and take advantage of it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before I go to the... yes, Sarah. Hello, congratulations. I already know there, I think.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. We have a little break this morning from, there was a COVID case at the UN, so I got to join this. And Tal, thank you so much for your presentation. And I think very poignant how you framed it in terms of us being the children of Abraham and sort of changing the way Israel is viewed in the Middle East, and sort of as also being a native people with the right of self-determination. I have 3 questions. The last 2 are sort of interrelated. You didn't really talk very much about if there is to be a change in administration in the United States, how you think that will affect these new agreements. Also on the issue that's been reported about the qualitative military edge in the F-35s, interested to hear what you think about that. And sort of interrelated, perhaps a more cynical view could think about, is this sort of our agreements crafted in a way to sort of achieve certain goals, and could this go the way of like Mauritania, for example, that at a later point it's used kind of as leverage against Israel, and the peace is suddenly canceled. So I'm curious sort of your thoughts about how to preserve these peace agreements, and sort of how to prevent, because we've had cases like that where we've established embassies and then that has been cut off. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I would say on the first point, I would say, obviously the current US administration put a tremendous amount of effort into moving these agreements forward, and we're profoundly grateful for that. But the goal of normalization between Israel and the Arab world has been a fixed priority for administrations for many, many years. One of the things that's changed are the circumstances, including with respect to Iran, including, I think, an increasing frustration, frankly, with the Palestinian approach to the conflict among some of the leaders in the Arab world, and a realization that there is just too much at stake not to develop this cooperation. So I think, we look forward to work with any US administration on moving this process forward and advancing, what are shared goals between Israel and the United States, I think. I'll answer your third question, which is a little bit easier for me to address. And that, I would say that, it goes back to what I mentioned before. The key in these agreements is making people feel the impact and the benefit and the potential. That the interconnections created, the investment, the travel, the tourism, the cooperation becomes so entrenched and almost feels inevitable that the opposite dynamic, I think, is highly unlikely. Also because we have deep relationships, we really see the region in a very similar way. And I think the decisions made here are strategic. They're not temporary. And we have a real interest in trying to do everything we can, but we share that interest with the Bahrainis and the Emiratis to develop it more and more into something very robust and very strong to withstand the different events that sometimes hit us in the Middle East.
Thank you. And the next questions come from Nobuhisha. I hope I pronounce it well. Please unmute yourself.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Bengal from NHK Tokyo. Tokyo is now before midnight. Thank you very much, Doctor. At this moment, which Arab country will be the next to have a normalization with Israel? And also, another question is about Saudi Arabia. How long it will take to have a normalization with Saudi Arabia? And what is the main obstacle so far? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for being up so late. I appreciate you being on the call. Your questions are too hard for me to answer. This is an on-the-record call, so I'm not comfortable sharing with you where we are with other countries and with Saudi Arabia. I will say that there is a very clear objective to expand the circle of peace, and we continue to work to add more and more countries to the group of countries that we will normalize with. But you'll forgive me for not offering details.
Oman is one of the candidates.
Oman has been mentioned as a candidate.
I think you got your answer there.
Thank you very much.
And we'll go on to Jacob Magid from the Time of Israel, right?
Hi Tal. Thanks for doing this. I just had a quick question, sort of related to what we're talking to, but I think related to what you work on, was Israel's decision to recognize Kosovo, and kind of curious how those kinds of recognitions regarding kind of territorial conflict impact maybe Israel's case in the ICC regarding the Palestinians and occupation and that kind of issue?
Well, so it's a very kind of legal question. So the answer, I hope, won't bore too many people. But I think the situation with Kosovo is each situation needs to be judged on its merits. I think many countries that have recognized Kosovo have talked about the unique circumstances of that. I think a key part of this also was that this was done in coordination with the US administration as part of an effort together with Serbia. So it's a very different type of dynamic. The factual situation in Kosovo is just fundamentally different to the one we face here. So I know that, you know, it looks like two conflicts and therefore somehow there may be parallels, but when you drill down, there are very few parallels.
Thank you. And there's someone from the chat that was asking or had a question. Isaac from Mexico. I don't see you on the screen. Try to unmute yourself. Okay, now I see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lior. Nice to see you. Thank you, Tal. Tal, you're a lawyer, and you speak about all the contracts that you made it in 2 weeks, let's say, the agreement. We know that contracts are made to break it. So my question is, how secure are these contracts not to depend on a person, like maybe President Trump, you say already about the administration, but with different leaders in the Arab world, and what will happen with the Palestinians in case they sign a contract, because these are contracts and they can be broken or they can be ignored by someone and say, these are unbreakable paper. So what are the key points in these contracts so they will be about states and have a secure peace around the time, along the time?
So it's a good question, an important question, and I think what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, the contracts, the text reflects a genuine will that is very widespread and a deep strategic decision. It is not like a piece of paper that you're trying to force on people. It is, the text itself is a reflection of an existing will and an existing strategic decision. And we see evidence of that by how quickly the parties want to create the conditions for investment, for travel, for tourism, for cooperation, because they see the potential in that relationship. So in that sense, I would say, you know, some contracts are meant to be broken, but some contracts are written because you want to do something, you want to achieve it. Like you would hope, for example, a marriage contract, most of the time, if you succeed, is because you're expressing a certain will, maybe not a great parallel, because there are sometimes divorce, of course. But in this case, it is a genuine commitment of both sides and the peoples on both sides to move to a different place. And I think that's why it's important. And perhaps one of the reasons why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been so difficult is because we ask in real terms whether a piece of paper we sign reflects a genuine will within the public. And when it doesn't reflect a genuine will within the public, there is that risk that you describe. And part of, I think, the entire dynamic here is to create a momentum within the Middle East for the publics, not just the leaders, but the publics to feel like there is real potential here that shouldn't be wasted.
Thank you. I saw Antonio raise his hand. Antonio, yeah, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Only a quick question. I hope you can answer me. I read that the agreements will be the Sudan. There is a big country with different problems and different situation from the Emirates or from other countries of the Gulf. Are there any differences between the agreements with the Sudan and the Arab Emirates, or they are the same for everyone and everyone is free to accept or not them? Thank you.
Thank you. So I related to this in a previous question that, of course, each of these agreements need to take account of the political conditions and the situation in each different country. And with Sudan, we will, and I'm sure the Sudanese officials will do the same thing. We've had a very important breakthrough with Sudan. In a way, it's very symbolic because Khartoum is, of course, represents in the Israeli consciousness the idea of the 3 no's of 67, no recognition, no peace, no negotiation. So the idea that that is turning around is really a symbolic moment. But the process of translating that decision into agreements will be a process that takes account of the transition situation that Sudan is in. And of course, with other countries too, each will be adjusted to their reality and to the particulars of their relationship. For example, with the UAE, the UAE is a country with a space program, and Israel is a country with a space program. So one of our big agreements is cooperation on the peaceful uses of outer space. I don't imagine we'll have that with Sudan. We may have something else.
Okay, I had a question here from the chat. It's from Inga. She asked, some people are saying that the UAE or in Bahrain agreements come on the expense of Jordan. Isn't that dangerous for Israel? How do you see that?
Well, if it were true, it would be dangerous for Israel, but fortunately it's not true, so I don't buy into the assumption. Israel has a strategic relationship with Jordan, has a vested interest in the stability and security of Jordan. And I think adding additional countries to the circle of peace, to having close relations with Israel, is something that is strengthening for Jordan and for the Israel-Jordan relationship. The more countries that join the circle of peace, the more countries that can cooperate to build the kind of region that Jordan and Israel seek. So I think that those people are simply mistaken.
Thank you. And I saw that Tor Bjorn, you had a question?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights with us. I was wondering, could you expand a little bit on what it was that started opening the doors to begin the process of developing towards normalization already 2 decades ago, and related to that, how big a role does the common worry about the Iran threat play in being drawn together, Israel and the Sunni states?
So, I mean, the connection with some of these countries, as has now become public, really began with the beginnings of the Oslo process, after the Madrid and the Oslo process, where Israel began to have quiet connections and gradually economic connections and sharing information and ideas and so on between these countries. And it was really built up over time. There was companies who did business together, and this was the gradual cultivation of a relationship in a way, as I mentioned before, that made this a kind of natural development rather than a sudden development. I mean, everybody, there isn't a one answer for everyone as to what it is that was the key. I personally think that the danger posed by Iran to the region is a major factor. I sometimes joke with people that Khamenei, the leader of Iran, should maybe be given some kind of peace award for helping push the countries together, because it was, to some extent, the hostility and aggression of Iran that made countries realize how important it is that they work together. So that's certainly part of it. But there are other elements as well, including the most simple one, which I think is just the tremendous potential in the cooperation in this relationship. You know, when 2 countries, I would say Israel is known as a startup nation, the UAE is a startup nation too. And in that respect, for these 2 countries to work together, I think we're only beginning to see. It's only the beginning of what is possible, not just for these 2 countries, but what together we can create in the region. I can certainly say similar about Bahrain and its leadership in a whole host of areas.
Thank you. I'll read another question from the chat. It's from, I hope I pronounce it right, Iftikhar Gilani, and the question is: Israel had normalization process earlier with Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, but that normalization did not help to give the right of self-determination to Palestinians. What is so different with the UAE and Bahrain and now with Sudan that will help ultimate peace? How far Israel can go to settle Palestinian issue and bring peace without addressing justice?
Well, it's an important question, and it requires a long answer, which I don't have the time to give, but I'll try to say a few things about it. There are many, many variables in moving towards peace, yes, and I don't think anyone knows how to create the necessary conditions, yes. As I mentioned beforehand, unfortunately, with Egypt and Jordan, though we have very important peace agreements, I don't know whether there's been that kind of normalization and warm peace which would have helped this, and I think these agreements are genuinely different in that way. They don't guarantee necessarily peace with the Palestinians, but they do create a different environment and a different sense of possibility, which I think is a critical ingredient. And there are many other ingredients. We need to see an end to terrorism and incitement. We need to have more mutual recognition and so on and so forth, many, many dimensions. And just to be clear, when you ask, it's a very important issue that you raise, how far can we settle the Palestinian issue without addressing justice? I think any conflict needs to do its best to address the victims of the conflict, to look at ways to create a better future. My point isn't that you don't address these issues. The point is how to address them. If they are addressed in the way, for instance, that the initiative at the ICC essentially seeks to address it, which is to kind of demonize one side and vindicate the other side, you are unlikely to produce peace. You're likely to produce polarization. And in the end, that is worse for more Palestinians and for more Israelis. And precisely by focusing more on the future, listening to people, listening to the past, but not allowing the past to kind of define you and hold you hostage, you actually have a chance of producing more justice and more peace. I know that there's a very popular slogan of no justice, no peace, yes? But when we think of justice in absolute terms, as if one side is completely right, the other side is completely wrong, what often happens is that you end up perpetuating the conflict. And I think a much more nuanced and complex approach is required that sees both Palestinians and Jews and recognizes that both need to see each other, talk to each other in order to move forward. Where are you from, Iftikhar? I don't know.
Well, I don't know where he's from. It doesn't say.
If you like, one time we'll go out for coffee and we can talk about this more.
Okay. There was a question from Karen. She said she's from Istanbul, if I remember correctly. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Karay Balansi from Istanbul, Turkey. Hi, everyone. I would like to ask you a question about Iran. Biden's presidency can bring back the nuclear deal with Iran. And during Obama's presidency, Iran had a return to the international system with this deal. Knowing that the threat perception of Iran shared with the Gulf countries especially is a crucial unifying factor in these positive developments, how do you assess this possibility?
It's a good question, but it's a tricky question for me to answer. First, because I'm a lawyer, and second, because you are talking to me about a hypothetical at the moment. So what I can say is that obviously Israel and many other countries in the region take the threat from Iran unbelievably seriously. The destabilizing impact of Iran's role in the region is clear to everyone. And I think Israel's position with respect to the nuclear deal is also clear. I don't think there's been a change in that. There needs to be, any approach to Iran needs to look fundamentally at its behavior, at its aggression across the region, and have serious ways of addressing and confronting that behavior. It isn't just a matter of how many centrifuges are spinning. It is a matter of the record and the intention of this regime, which has to be confronted with the utmost seriousness.
Okay, thank you. I got a question, an answer for your question from our spokesperson in India. He said that this guy is a journalist from India. And there is another question here from Suman Sharma. We can hear you. I don't know if...
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
I hope I'm audible. Yeah. Sir, you mentioned that having a dialogue with Palestine is more advisable than going to court to settle matters. So what exactly are you doing? What efforts are you putting in to bring the Palestinians to the table to have a dialogue with you? What have you done till now?
Well, I mean, to be frank, we continue to say to the Palestinians to please come to the table. We've been saying that for years, and to do so without preconditions. I think you have a history of rounds of negotiations with the Palestinians in which you had Israeli leaders who really took serious and difficult and brave decisions. In the last round, for instance, with Secretary Kerry, a proposal was put on the table that, in my experience of it, the Palestinians simply did not respond to when President Obama put that proposal to them on the table. Now, I'm not suggesting, I'm not a big fan of the blame game of saying one side is to blame or the other side is to blame. I think that the Palestinians need to think, and I would encourage them to think, they're my neighbors, they're the people we will share our future with, and I encourage them to think about whether this normalization is a threat or an opportunity. Unfortunately, for the moment, the Palestinian leadership has somehow treated it as a threat, that there is more chance for cooperation and coordination between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And I think, and I hope that with time, they will see it as an opportunity to actually encourage and grow peace in the region. We welcome them to a dialogue, and I do believe that by speaking to each other over time, we can better understand each other and move to a better place, even if we can't resolve everything.
Thank you, Tal. And we'll take one last question from the chat. We're trying to keep it under an hour. We're almost there. The question is from Joseph Federman, and he asked me, the UAE insisted on freezing the West Bank annexation as a condition for this deal. So there seems to be at least some concern about the Palestinian among those Arab countries. How much did the Palestinian issue come up in your negotiation with those countries? And did they require any Israeli commitments to deal with the issue? And then he added, in other words, have they abandoned the Palestinian cause?
Well, I mean, to be frank, I think that I don't want to speak for both those countries. What I have heard them say is, quite frankly, that they see this agreement as being critical to helping the Palestinian cause, not to hurting it. And I frankly agree with them, because the idea that you are going to have a close relationship with Israel and the capacity through that close relationship to talk together about the situation in the region, the idea that you're empowering the forces of coexistence in the region and pushing back against extremists, in my view, can only be helpful to peace. The UAE, Bahrain, and other countries, I think, see this step as a contribution to Israeli-Palestinian peace, and I think that's the way it should be seen. It doesn't mean necessarily we'll agree about everything, but having a format to have the dialogue, building this relationship, I think can only help. And when you look more broadly at the Middle East, if you think about it in these terms, in the Middle East, there are forces pushing us towards chaos and disorder and extremism. And there are forces pushing us towards cooperation, mutual legitimacy, recognition. Where does this agreement fall? I think it's quite clear that this agreement can only contribute to those and empower those elements who want cooperation, who sees Jews and Palestinians and Sunni and Shia as each all belonging to the region and needing a space. And so in that sense, I think it can only be a blessing to the broader cause of coexistence in the Middle East and to the specific cause of Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation.